We are starting the conditional statement part of our foldable, so turn to the second flap. We're starting off with hypothesis. I know that y'all know what that is in other classes, but in math, it is the cause of a statement. The part of the conditional statement that follows the if, and that will make sense to y'all in just a minute. But the hypothesis does not include the word if. And that's the word if. Conclusion is the effect of a statement, the part of a conditional statement that follows the then. And it does not include the word then. And again, the if then thing will make sense in a minute. Conditional statements express a cause and effect relationship in the form if then. In this form, it is easier to tell which is the cause and which is the effect. So we're supposed to underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion and write each as a conditional statement. So whenever Amy goes to the store, she buys milk. Amy goes to the store is the hypothesis. She buys milk is the conclusion. So whenever we write it as a conditional, it should say if Amy goes to the store, then she buys milk. Now, as you can see the hypothesis and conclusion a lot easier this way. Everything after the if, and well, between the if and the then, is the hypothesis. It does not include the if or the then. That's what that meant before. The conclusion is everything after the then, but does not include the then. So that's what I meant by you'll understand this in a minute. The hypothesis is everything without the if, and the conclusion is everything without the then. Number 2 says angles are supplementary because they add to 180. So angles are supplementary is the hypothesis, and they add to 180 is the conclusion. So when we rewrite it, it says if angles are supplementary, then they add to be 180. And again, everything in between the if and the then, but without the if and then. And everything after the then, but without the then. So hypothesis, conclusion. This one is kind of backwards. Anytime it's a when, it's going to be flipped. So this is your hypothesis and this is your conclusion. When always means flip-flop. So if x equals 2, then 2x equals 4. Hypothesis, conclusion. A dog has a tail. A dog is a hypothesis, and a tail is the conclusion. So if an animal is a dog, then that animal has a tail. Or then it has a tail. Hypothesis, conclusion. Now, you can also say if an animal has a tail, then it is a dog, if you had written it backwards, but that doesn't necessarily make sense because there are lots of animals that have tails. For number 1, it says Amy goes to the store, she buys milk. You could say that if she buys milk, then she goes to the store, but that just doesn't quite sound right. So you need to make sure that whenever you write these, that they sound right. You can't just put them in any order. You have to make sure it's a hypothesis and a conclusion. And that's why in math, we do it in if-then sentences so that you can tell the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right, we are going to do one more flap, so go to the next. Okay, the next flap is talking about converse, inverse, and contrapositive. And we use conditional statements to do that. So, it gives us the following conditional. If an animal is a goose, then it has a beak. So remember, this is the hypothesis, and then this is the conclusion. For the converse, we call it flip-flop, and you can remember it because flip-flops and converses both go on your feet. So converse is flip-flop, and all that means you're going to take this underline and put it where the circle is, and take the circle and put it where the underline is. So you're literally going to keep the if and then where they are, but take the underline and the circle and flip them. So for a converse, you will write if it has a beak. Comma, then an animal is a goose. So I literally just flipped what was underlined, what was circled with each other. Now, you can rewrite the sentence to make it make a little more sense. So instead of saying it has a beak, you could say if an animal has a beak, then it is a goose. That is perfectly fine. It actually makes more sense that way. I just wrote it this way so you would see what we're physically doing to that sentence is just flip-flopping it. So now this one was the conclusion, and this one was a hypothesis. So I literally just flipped the circle and the underlined apart. We call inverse not. And all that means is you need to negate that underlined part and the circle part. You need to you add a not to the underline and a not to the circle. Now, what I mean by that isn't necessarily the whole word not, but you're going to somehow make it not say what it says. I know that kind of sounds confusing, but just follow along with me and you'll understand if you just pay attention. But sometimes it really is just putting the word not in there. So it says if an animal is a goose. So how do I undo that? How do I say an animal is not a goose? Exactly like that. So if an animal is not a goose, then how do I make it say it does not have a beak? Well, you could say it doesn't have a beak or it does not have a beak. Hypothesis is still this beginning part. So if an animal is a goose, except now it has a big knot in it. And then the conclusion is then it does not. And then it originally had has, but we had to change that word to make it make sense. A beak. So that's my kind of broken circle around the conclusion. But you can see how it changed, but it still looks fairly the same. It's just we added knots to the underline and the circle. Contrapositive is both of them together. It's kind of like taking the converse of the inverse. It's flip-flop, not. So we just took the inverse. So we want to flip-flop this inverse. So we're still going to start with if, but instead of this underlined stuff, we're going to do the circle stuff there. So if it does not have a beak, then an animal is not a goose. So it's just like the inverse up above it, it's just flip-flopped. So just like before. Okay, so converse, remember, is flip-flop. So let's underline our hypothesis, circle our conclusion. That makes it easier to flip-flop. So I start with if, and then I write all the circle stuff. It has 3 equal sides. Then I write all the underlined stuff. A triangle is an equilateral. The inverse is adding knots to those things. So if, and how do I say a triangle is not an equilateral? Just like that, a triangle is not an equilateral. So if a triangle is not an equilateral, then it does not have 3 equal sides. You just make it somehow say it doesn't have 3 equal sides. So if we consider these knots the hypothesis, and then this with the knots the conclusion, to do the contrapositive, we take the converse of the inverse. So we're flipping the inverse. So if, and then all the circle stuff, it does not have 3 equal sides, or it doesn't have 3 equal sides. Then all the underlined stuff. A triangle is not an equilateral. Example 2. Today is Saturday is a hypothesis. I sleep in is the conclusion. So flip-flop it for the converse. If I sleep in, then today is Saturday. Inverse is you just put knots in those two things. So if today is not Saturday, then I do not sleep in. Contrapositive is flipping the inverse. So if I do not sleep in, then today is not Saturday. That was a little messed up writing. Sorry about that. And that's the end of your video for today. Make sure that y'all remember this whenever Monday comes around.